Hello and welcome to CSC Live. Today's guests are the filmmakers behind the hit news show Station 11. Director of Photography Daniel Grant, CSC, Director Jeremy Podeswa, and Colorist Cody Baker.
Welcome to CSC Live. I'm Jeremy Podeswa, the director and executive producer on Station 11. Daniel, you are?
One of three DPs on Station 11. Unfortunately, the fellow CSC member Steve Cousins couldn't be with us today, who shot 4 episodes. I did 4 as well, and then Christian Sprenger, who did the pilot episodes 1 and 3. And so we're here representing them today.
Great. Well, Daniel, we have lots to talk about. Love to talk with you about the show and also talk with you a little bit about you and how we came together on this project. Maybe it's a good thing to start off this whole thing by showing a trailer for Station 11. Do you want to see that? And then we can get into a little bit about us and a little bit about the show. So Byron, if it's okay with you, let's maybe just show the first trailer for Station 11.
Hey, excuse me? Is this because of that thing? Should I go somewhere?
You should go home.
This virus kills.
Chaos.
I think this thing is really happening. You can see it out there. I can't stay here. It's not safe.
I stood, looking over the damage, trying to remember the sweetness of life on Earth. But there is no before, only now.
I was late. You were early.
Been adrift in a stranger's galaxy for a long, long time.
I have found you 9 times before. Maybe 10. And I'll find you again. There is no rescue mission. We are safe.
This strange and awful time was the happiest of my life.
It's the only thing that there's just.
Is it just me, or does that get you every time?
It gets me every time. It's amazing. I love love
I know.
that.
I want to see that show. It looks pretty good.
Well, Jeremy, maybe sometimes people ask me what the show is about, and it's hard to encapsulate. You probably do a better job than I. Maybe if you could tell people who haven't seen it, like what the show's actually about, which is kind of
Okay.
it's tough, but
It is hard to be reductive about it, but first of all, I should say it's based on this beautiful novel by Emily St. John Mandel, a Canadian writer. And it's about a pandemic that kills 9/10 of the world's population. And I mean, this is just the pure narrative. And it goes back and forth in time, just before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and 20 years later, following a group of characters. And it becomes a meditation on life and mortality and art, and what it means to be alive and what are the things that really matter at the end of the day. And it's a show about everything, really. I mean, it's really hard to encapsulate, but it in its kind of like focus on these, rather than focusing on this huge pandemic, sci-fi kind of premise, it focuses on these very human characters and all the trials and tribulations and things that they go through as they try to navigate this extraordinary situation over time. Um, how's that, Daniel? How would you
That's pretty
describe it?
good. Yeah, that's pretty good. That's much better than I would have done.
Well,
Yeah,
I
and
do.
were you?
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
No, no, I was going to ask if you were aware of the
Yeah.
book. Like, had you before the series came together? Because obviously it was written, I think, 2014, right? And um,
Yes.
there was I understand the book really became um, a lot more popular when COVID happened. It just seemed
Hmm.
so strangely prescient, and obviously the series as well. You guys started work on that just before COVID hit, so um, it made for a really interesting situation.
Well, actually, the project was in development long before COVID hit, and we actually 2 episodes were shot before COVID as well.
Mm.
So, Emily wrote this book in a pre-COVID world, but it was a post-SARS and post other, sort of mini pandemics before. And she was writing in response to those kinds of things. But I think it seems very prescient now because it seems so directly about the times that we've lived through and are living through. But it's really, I think, for her, largely a meditation on life and art and many other things that are universal and sort of expand and resonate beyond just the specific thing that we're dealing with. I just think now it happens to
Mhm.
really resonate because it's so specific. It seems so
Mhm. Mhm.
specific to our time. But
Mhm.
yeah, no, the whole thing started like much earlier, and I got involved really many, many months before the pandemic. I had met Patrick Somerville, the creator of the show, um, quite a long time actually before the thing actually even started shooting. And Hiro Murai had been involved already with Patrick for a little while on the show. He became the director of episode. He was the director of episode 1 and 3, an executive producer as well. And I came on to be a sort of second producing director after Hiro was meant to leave the show to go off and do Atlanta, his other series. And so that was sort of organized well in advance. And then I went off and did some other show, and then this show was coming together. And then eventually, the whole thing came together, and Hero shot those 2 episodes in Chicago. And then the pandemic hit, and the show went down for 7 or 8 months until we regrouped. And then I took over the show basically, and we did the next
Mhm.
8 episodes in Toronto.
Mhm.
So that's
Mhm.
the origin of the whole thing.
Yeah, cool.
But
And
before
then
we
I
get too
guess,
deep into
yeah,
but I was just going to say, before we get too deep into Station 11, maybe we should just sort of back up a little bit and talk about you and me a little bit, and then how we came together
sure.
on this project, and then we can
Mhm.
talk through it a bit. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your background, and
Sure.
maybe I'll learn some things that I didn't know before.
Um, yeah, so I grew up out east actually. I'm originally from Prince Edward Island and grew up mostly in Halifax. And I kind of came to film late. Like I started to get really interested in photography in high school. And I had always thought I was kind of going down more of sort of like a science route. And uh, I loved photography. We had a dark room in our school, and I eventually ended up kind of building a dark room in my basement and spent like all my time there. And and around the same time, I was also getting really interested in film, but it didn't seem to me. It seemed so far away. Like the idea of actually working in film. I think I had
Mm,
this notion like, oh, I guess you become a director if you want to work in film, and I didn't know about all these different roles, and eventually realized that there was this role of director of photography, and um, that just kind of really sparked my imagination, and I just kind of became convinced that that was um, what I wanted to do. And actually, it kind of, interestingly enough, around that same time, I also realized that people made really interesting films in Canada, which is something that I think prior to that, I kind of had this notion that that didn't exist in Canada. And one of the films actually that kind of opened my eyes to that was The Five Senses, which is one of your films.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's really nice to hear.
Um, it's such a beautiful film, and of course, Gregory Middleton. Gregory shot that, right? Yeah, it's
Yes, he
such a
did.
beautiful
Yeah.
film. Hmm.
Mhm.
And
Oh,
so I started, realizing that people did make really interesting films in Canada. And as I went to film school, and just to make a long story short, I guess um, I after I graduated, I mostly worked in documentary. That was kind of where a lot of my early opportunities were, and I loved doing that. I just slowly got more into fiction and doing short films, and eventually doing very, very, very small features that kind of slowly turned into slightly bigger features. And it's really just in the last couple of years I've tried to get a little bit more involved in television. This is Station 11 was my first series. Like, really, my background is in fiction. It's really in features. So it was a really interesting experience, kind of transitioning
mm,
from features to television. Because yeah, it was for me. It was a really smooth transition because everybody involved in the project was so great, um, including Steve. I had known Steve a little bit in recent
mhm.
years. Had done a little bit of second unit for him, and had been always been aware of his work. And so to be able to alternate with Steve Cousins was just a great opportunity for me, because I just knew that I could go to him if there was anything I didn't, anything that was new to me in terms of the format. And but it was all very intuitive in the end. How about
Mhm.
yourself? Like, obviously, you also come from features
I
originally,
do.
but what was
Mhm.
your journey like?
Oh, that's a long one. But in a nutshell, I grew up in Toronto. I came from a family of artists, actually, and was quite steeped in visual art in particular. My dad was a painter, his father was a painter, my brother's a painter, um, but I can't paint, so I had to find my own form of artistic expression. And I was always really fascinated by movies and television, and I didn't know anybody in that field, so it was a very remote notion. But I had a real interest in it, so I pursued it, and I did go to film school. And as soon as I started to make my first short films in school, I kind of knew that this was the thing for me. It was a medium that really suited me very well as a collaborative medium and as a form of personal expression. It was like really right up my alley, and I really enjoyed it. And I had some success with some short films I made when I was in school, and um, yeah, so it felt like a very natural fit. So I never really looked back after that. And I made short films, and I made my first feature. It's called Eclipse, which went to Sundance and Berlin. And then I made a second feature, The Five Senses, which you saw,
Hmm.
which went to Cannes and Directors Fortnight. And then that really sort of launched me into a TV career, strangely, which I never thought I would have. But through a very complex series of convolutions, um, I got invited after doing The Five Senses to do 6 Feet Under, with my first American
Mm,
TV show, the first season of that. And that proved to be a very auspicious and fabulous way of
yeah,
starting a TV career. Um,
yeah,
and so it wasn't the phenomenon at the time that it became, but I knew going into it that it was a really special artistic experience, and the show was, not like any TV that had existed before. Really, it was really the beginning of a big wave of what now we call the golden age of television, with shows
mm,
like The Sopranos and The Wire, and all those things. And 6 Feet Under was part of that vanguard, and that got me in with HBO. And then my career went that way, and I
hmm,
followed it very happily, where it was organically going. And I ended up doing things like Carnival and Rome and The Pacific and Boardwalk Empire and all these HBO shows, which were a gift, really, because I came
hmm.
from very small independent personal filmmaking, and never in a million years thought I would be in Cinecittà directing you know Roman soldiers walking through ancient Rome, and that kind of thing. Like, that whole Cecil B. DeMille aspect of things.
Yeah.
Never ever ever thought I'd be doing that. And And that, starting to do things with a larger canvas moved me towards things like Game of Thrones ultimately, and then to Station 11, which was my first opportunity as an executive producer, where I had a lot more responsibility for the larger scope of the show, but also was very involved in more world building and, what I like to call intimate epic filmmaking, where, it's broad canvas, but, very character based kind of show. And that's, for me, that's the most interesting kind of work to do in a way, because it's, it's cinematic, but it's also very, very personal and emotional, potentially, hopefully, nuanced storytelling and complex storytelling, but at the same time working in a very, kind of large scope canvas, which I really, really love. So, and circling back now to you, I think that what I was so happy in finding you and Steve to do this show is that I felt like you guys could really bring both of those aspects to the show. Like, based on your previous work, even though you hadn't done much TV before, I could see even in the amount of feature film work that you've done that there was a kind of sophistication cinematically, and also, great storytelling and intimacy in the filmmaking, and it really felt like a good fit for this show. And I think the fact that you and Steve had worked together before was a great bonus for me, knowing, or not that you worked together before, that you knew each other's work and you appreciated each other's work. And I saw some aesthetic similarities in the work too, and I felt like you guys would be a great fit together, and also a great fit for the show, which proved to be very true. So I'm so happy that you both did the show. It just would not have been the same show without you.
Yeah, well, that was it was such a great experience being able to collaborate like that with another DP, because we're very used to doing stuff on our own. We have our responsibilities that we kind of that we feel like we are that it's just things that we feel like we're responsible for, and to be able to kind of really just like bounce ideas off somebody in a way that is in a way that you can, like, we very much speak the same language and have kind of like the same worries and anxieties and everything. Like, it's really nice. And actually, Steve had not, even though Steve's done lots of television, he hadn't alternated before either, so it was kind of just interesting, I think, for him too, like the idea of also picking up where somebody has left off, because as we talked about, Christian Sprenger and Hiro Murai had done 2 episodes, pre-pandemic episodes, and but the work that they did was so beautiful and inspiring. I think we both felt like they were speaking a language that we understood, and that we could pick up where they left off. And it was just such a great, the whole thing was just such a great opportunity to kind of like play in this amazing world.
Can you talk a little bit about how that collaboration worked in action? Like, I think, if it wasn't the right chemistry between DPs, it could be a disaster. But it is something that is done very commonly in shows where, DPs will trade off. But in this particular case, it was a very, very strong chemistry between the two of you. But can you speak a little bit about what are the challenges of doing that, and what are the benefits, or just like how technically do you guys mesh so that, like, you each are kind of doing your own thing, but you're making the same show?
Yeah. Well, one of the first things we did was, myself and Steve and you all had a meeting with Christian, and that was a really great first step, because we were able to kind of just get an insight onto his thinking when he started it, his and Heroes. And it was interesting, because the episode that they did had been primarily sort of in the year 0 world. Like, we kind of talked about it as the year 0 and year 20, because those are two time periods that the story jumps back and forth between, one being like just before the pandemic, and one being 20 years after the pandemic has hit. And actually, very little of the pandemic itself is depicted. It's mostly what you see is what happened before and after. And so they hadn't, because they shot all that year zero stuff in Chicago, and um, none of that post-pandemic year 20 stuff had been done yet. We were able to talk about kind of different ideas of what that might look like and how the visual language might evolve. Um, and kind of what they had been thinking, but because obviously the show went on hold, they didn't get a chance to kind of fully develop those ideas. So it was an interesting situation where we had like all this amazing material to kind of draw inspiration from, but we were going to kind of take it into a new world, and being this year 20 world. And as well, just the way that the episodes are written, there is crossover in terms of certain like really key locations. Like a lot of time is spent of the story is spent at the airport. Um, and but the episodes, a lot of the episodes are kind of like their own worlds. And so we stylistically there was a lot of overlap, but then we had our kind of our own worlds that we were responsible for. So basically we just kind of spent a lot of time talking. We would scout together sometimes, but mostly we would just spend a lot of time talking and trying to figure out, especially anywhere where our work overlapped, like how we were going to deal with that, or if someone was going to do a location, establish it in like year zero, how that was going to affect what the other team might be doing at that location in year 20. So sometimes it would be we would talk about how we would set up those worlds so that they would work. In year 20, there's no power. Everything is kind of lit by daylight or fire. And so those kind of puzzles were the, things that we're trying to think about. So that's kind of how that kind of just trying to look out for each other as well. Like just trying to make good choices that were going to work. If we were going to establish something in one location, making sure that those are choices that were going to work for, what the other team had to do there.
And I don't want this to be like an interview, but I do want to ask you a couple other questions, and you can ask me too. But
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
curious, with just in addition to collaborating with another DP and actually two other DPs in a way, you are also working with different directors on this show, which again is a common thing. But I don't think you'd really done that before, really, on a show, right? So in this
No.
case, you're working with largely with Helen Shaver and Lucy Cherniak, and then a little bit with me. So
A little bit, a couple days.
a few days, yeah, a few very enjoyable days. Actually, great days. In fact, what we did was really beautiful together. But do you want to talk a little bit about that and how that feels, and how you adjust to working with different directors, and what are the differences?
Well, that was interesting for me because I'm so used to features where my primary collaborator is the director, and for me, I'm also I feel like I'm a different DP for every director. Kind of needs a little bit something different from their DP, right? So you are a bit of a different DP with every director. So it was interesting to go into a project where I was going to be working with multiple directors, and every director is so different, obviously. And but it was really exciting. Like I loved it because you're taking material and you're kind of filtering it through different artists. And I got the sense that Patrick Somerville, the showrunner, really trusted his directors to kind of take ownership over their episodes. And of course you were there, as a guiding hand to kind of help with the sort of the just big picture, making sure that everybody was kind of on point stylistically. But it was really interesting. Like the first thing that we shot was episode 7, that all takes place in Frank's apartment, and I did that with Lucy Cherniak. And my experience with Lucy was that she was in quarantine almost for her entire prep. I think she got out like I think she had 4 days of prep or something before she started. But that was all on a set, so we actually did all that prep over Zoom, and it was ended up being really efficient because we had 3D models of the set. We used a couple different programs to help us kind of work all of that out. Pardon me. And then my experience with Helen was totally different because just the nature of the schedule, we were more hitting the ground running because it was halfway through the series, and so locations and scripts were often changing like as we worked. So a lot of that was a lot more on the fly, which Helen is very comfortable with, and so that was like a completely different style of working. But I enjoyed both, and I love the directors I worked with; they were amazing.
And then there was me, of course,
Yeah.
for 2 days. But let me throw it back to you. Anything you want to talk to me about the show?
Well, I'm curious. Like as a director, and obviously in this case, you also were kind of acting as like a directing producer, where part of your job was to kind of work with all the individual directors. Like you were prepping all of the episodes at the beginning before those directors actually came on. So you were kind of setting things up, choosing locations. And then obviously once things got rolling, you had your own episodes to deal with, but you were also still, working with the individual directors. So what's that like for you?
It was really interesting, actually. And, it's my first time really taking on that role in a sort of formal way, even though I've been involved in a lot of shows, like in the first season and being very early in the season where I am not, and it's a sort of proprietary way involved in the show, even though I'm just directing, not technically producing, but, there's a little bit of crossover, when you're doing something like that. But in this show, like, the responsibility was much greater and more complicated because of COVID as well. We had, as you said, Lucy was quarantining for almost her entire prep. I think she really only had a couple days where she was on set to prep on her own with you before shooting. Helen also flew in, not because of COVID, but she had another show that she had done just before, and she had, I don't know, like a week of prep or something to do, before she was even less on the ground, probably before she got to launch into her quite complicated work. And so I was really the only director there for the prep of the entire series. So I came on the show, and I mean I was there on the ground in November in Toronto, and actually none of the other producers were there for the entire prep because of COVID. They couldn't come to Toronto from LA.
Hmm.
So it was a complicated situation. So I was there from November until February when we started shooting, and that was, I had to make a lot of decisions for other directors, not decisions, but I guess
Hmm.
get the ball rolling so that, some things had to be decided ahead of time. Like I even remember on, Frank's apartment set that Lucy was going to shoot, that I had a strong feeling that that any director was going to have a problem with the configuration of the bedroom. And then,
Yes.
and remember that whole conversation. And so I spearheaded a change of the design a little bit so that it
Hmm.
would be more film and director friendly. And I think, those kind of things where you just have to kind of
Hmm.
like anticipate what a director is going to need or want. And like if I was doing it, I would certainly want that to be the case. So those kind of things. Then kind of pre-selecting many, many locations for Helen in particular, because she was out on the road a lot for her episodes. Um, so that she wasn't starting from scratch when she came in. And of course she could veto and change things, but I had to really do a ton of groundwork for her. And then, just kind of like looking at everybody's dailies all the time and just kind of getting a sense of how it was all going for everybody and checking in with people all the time. And, I
Hmm.
think, thankfully, Lucy and Helen are fantastic directors and they didn't need a huge amount of guidance, but everybody needs support every once in a while for all kinds of reasons, whether it's logistic or aesthetic or, just for other practical reasons.
Hmm.
So that's, my role is just to be there and to help when help is needed. And I enjoy that role, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard
Yeah,
when
and it's
you're directing
interesting.
too, because, you know,
Mm,
when you're directing a lot, it's hard to kind of be on top of everything. But
mhm.
but yeah, I mean, as I said, when you have strong directors you're working with, it's easier.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really struck me that I really had to get used to was um, just the amount of unknowns when you start, because there were so many locations that had to be found. And
Mhm.
because really the only set we had when we started with was the Frank's apartment set, which was an absolutely, I must say, Ruth Ann was the production designer, and that was is probably one of the most, I
Mhm.
think it's one of the most beautiful sets I've ever worked on. It was like you couldn't make a bad frame in there. It was amazing. And
Mhm.
but I realized, in the format of television, the thing that you really have to um, develop a high tolerance for is all of the uncertainties, because things change
Mhm.
as you shoot and locations change, and even stuff that we shot in the winter, sometimes those locations, we shot in a forest, I remember, and it became we didn't have access to that in the summer. We had planned to shoot there in the summer again because of, it was for some COVID reason, I can't remember now, but anyways,
Mhm.
just developing a certain tolerance for all the uncertainties in kind of like the television format.
Well, I'm so glad that you guys were so flexible, really, because, you know, it's true that you do always have to be, accommodating, and things do change, but they changed on this show more than most. And it was just it was the nature of the beast, and was a very organic, creative process making this show. And
Mm,
I think that everybody, there was a kind of looseness which really made the show what it is in a way. I mean, it looks very crafted, and it is very crafted, but at the same time, there's a
mhm.
huge amount of sort of um, kind of like people discovering things as they go along, and
Yeah,
on the producing side, I would say too. Like, just like, this is really working, let's do that, or this is leading to some other
yeah,
idea, and this thing feels better than that thing, so let's do that thing instead of the thing we thought we were going to do. And it's just, there was a
yeah,
lot of that kind of thing on this, which is quite unusual, actually. Like, it, especially on the shows of this scale, it doesn't usually happen that much. But I think, mercifully, thankfully, we had people like you and Steve and the directors, who were really kind of down for the experiment of this show in a weird way, and and
yeah,
up for the experiment. And it was it was really, it ended up being like an amazing creative experience, I think, for everybody. But it was not entirely typical. It wasn't the most
mm,
kind of conventional way of doing things. um,
mhm,
we
mhm.
have, Cody standing by. Do you want to maybe introduce him and bring him in to our
Yeah,
conversation?
yeah. So we have someone, our special guest joining us, Cody Baker, colorist of Station 11. Hey, Cody, how's it going?
Hey, Cody.
Great. Thanks for inviting me and having me along on this fantastic project.
Yeah, yeah. So we worked with Cody. First, those episodes that Christian Sprenger shot with Hiro Murai, um, colorist Sam Daly did those, and then what was and then Cody was able to pick up where Sam left off, and um, color I mean, it's a huge part of the show, and something that I think people have really remarked on is the show doesn't look like a typical, post-apocalyptic show. It's full of color, it's full of nature. There's a lushness to a lot of those scenes, and it's as opposed to what people often see in something like The Road, which is like drained of color and often drained of life. Something that
Mm.
Patrick was really, really keen on, and I'm so glad we were able to follow through on this, is this idea that the future, this post-pandemic world, is like very lush, and that there is, this presence of nature everywhere. And so, Cody, it'd be interesting to talk to you a bit about what the process was like for you, and yeah, we could kind of get into some of the. I'm always interested because talking to colors, it's almost like when you're working with the colors, it's like working with a musician in a way. It's very hard to parse out what you actually do, and so much of it is just dependent upon taste. And so I'm going to be interested to kind of pick your brain on like what your process was like on Station 11, and if you can kind of tell us a bit about sort of the visual ingredients of the show.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, Patrick's vision, and of course yours and Steve's and Jeremy's and Christian's, everyone's vision for the future was supposed to be a little different than your traditional apocalyptic story. Because I think when we initially spoke about this show being a possibility, I went and read the book, and I loved it. I was fascinated by it, and I kind of had my own vision of that future as well, and it was sort of in line with where we ended up, which is great. And so it's always a struggle to try to keep that feeling real and natural, without being over like hyper saturated, right? Because we didn't want to go with that desaturated look where everything felt dead and the road, and where the future is gloomy and dark. This was supposed to be more like the world is sort of recovering from this incident and becoming reborn, and life is coming back. So yeah, part of that look was started by Sam Daly and Christian Springer, and we took that and definitely ran with that. But part of the, I guess, advantage of these stories and these episodes sort of being somewhat independent, I mean, they're all connected, but they were somewhat independent, is that allowed us to adapt and adjust that look based on those locations. And because the time is jumping, right? Year 0 and year 20 and all that stuff in between, we were able to sort of adjust the look and adapt it as it felt appropriate. So, I mean, that's kind of like, I guess, the overall approach, but just in terms of like where I started, I think we started on like episode 7, right? That's the first one I got to look at. So I read the book, and then the first episode I'm working on was episode 7. And I remember thinking, what is going on in this show? But it ended up working really well when you finally see it in context. It all makes sense. But that was a fascinating one for us to start with, because of course, with any colorist, you have to learn that language with your DPs, right? Part of my job is to collaborate with you and kind of be an extension digitally of what you had intended, right, when you shot it. So it's learning that language, and I think we kind of developed that and made it work. So yeah, I mean, I could go into more details on specific stuff if you'd like, but I mean, that's kind of the general approach.
I think, Daniel, what do you think about... Oh, sure. I was going to say, maybe we can show a clip from... I mean, we can go ahead with your question, but I also thought it might be nice to show a clip from the show, and then that could lead to other conversation of, approach.
Great.
But did you have another question that you want to ask Cody first before we do that?
No, I was going to, just start bringing up some stills and stuff like that.
Oh, very good.
But I think it'd be great to show a clip for the show. And do you have one that you think would be good, Jeremy? I think we have got 4 or 5 clips in there.
Yeah. I was thinking maybe just start from the earlier part of the show in episode 102 and the Hamlet sequence.
Great.
Which sort of deals with a lot. Actually, we're dealing with year 0 and year 20 in the same sequence, and we can talk about that a little bit too.
Mm-hmm. And this is something that Steve Cousins shot, I'll say, with that Jeremy directed, and I think to give you for those who are interested. I'm pretty sure that Steve lit this entirely with fire, if I'm not mistaken. I know that was kind of his plan. So, yeah, you can think about that as you watch it.
Yes,
Byron, if you can play that clip.
Have you your father's leave? What says Polonius?
He hath, my lord, wrung from me my slow leave by laboursome petition, and at last upon his will I sealed my hard consent. I do beseech you, give him leave to go.
And now, Laertes, you told us of some suit.
My dread lord, your leave and favor to return to France, from whence still wittingly I came to Denmark, to show my duty in your coronation. Yet now, I must confess that duty done, my thoughts and wishes bend again toward France, and bow them to your gracious leave and pardon.
Have you your father's leave? What says Polonius?
He hath, my lord, wrung from me my slow leave.
But now, my cousin Hamlet, and my son.
A little more than kin, and less than kind.
How is it the clouds still hang on you?
Not so, my lord. I am too much in the sun.
Good Hamlet, cast thy nighted color off.
and let thine eye look like a friend on Denmark. Do not forever with thy veiled lids seek thy noble father in the dust. Thou knowest 'tis common. All that lives must die, passing through nature to eternity. Aye, madam. It is common. If it be, why seem it so particular with thee?
She still hasn't eaten. 3 days.
Cool. Thank you, Byron.
Us. So that gives a little bit of a taste of that sequence, and we can talk a little bit about the approach to this, because as you were saying before, with the year 20, there's no electricity, and so everything's dictated either by, lighting is dictated by natural light or some sort of fire source. And I think it was definitely in my mind and Steve's that I really wanted to do the sequence at night. There was some discussion for practical purposes to shoot it during the day, but for me, it was essential that for the mood of the thing and for the aesthetic reasons that it should be at night, and that the firelight should do 95% of the work. So I think that there was actually like one big overhead, crane. What do you call those? You're the technical guy, Daniel.
It was like a
We
big
had one of those
it was a big softbox, I think.
yeah, a big like sort of fire soft light up on top, and that was it. And then everything else was just the actual torches. And we also did a Hamlet sequence indoors at the Science Center, which was meant to be the airport, and that was also lit the same way. So we did a lot of testing to make sure that the levels of the fire were going to be sufficient, and in terms of how the thing was blocked, that people were going to be lit as they needed to be lit. There was quite a lot of sort of organizing for it, and plumbing the stage with gas and everything so that everything could be working and things could be turned off and on and raised and lowered. But I was really pleased with that, because it really I wanted it to feel like the Globe Theater during the Renaissance, or when traveling medieval traveling companies that would do passion plays and things like that. It should feel like it's that kind of thing, and that's what we were going for. The future is really the past again, in a way. So I think that was a very strong sort of approach to the theatrical presentation. And then you see in this clip also there's things that are in Frank's apartment, which you spent a lot of time in, and I spent a little bit of time in, and that had its own dictates in terms of lighting, but it was largely practicals too, I think. And there was there was a lot of built-in lighting in the ceiling and other places that was really effective. It didn't really need to do much. Like, I have to say the overall approach in lighting this show was very much, certainly with Steve, who I worked with mainly, was very minimal lighting. Like, we didn't really, it was a lot of practicals and some support when you needed it, but it was really very naturalistic, and we were very agile. Like, it's a big, complicated show, but it wasn't cumbersome. Like, there wasn't like a lot of waiting around for lighting and things like that. Like, it was, in most situations we were really agile, which I thought was really great.
Yeah, I think that was something that I think we were all keen on at the start, especially because nature is such a big part of the show, that working with natural sources and really trying to push what could be done with working with even just with practicals and with fire and even night exteriors. Like, one thing I love about that sequence is that you have all this fire, and I think typically you would probably, you would have like a big moonlight source or something like that to create a little bit of separation. But I love that Steve just used the fire, and actually in the way deep in the background, you can see that tiny little horizon, which I think is actually just a little bit of ambience from the city, but you would never, there's something so beautiful and painterly about that. You would never see that if you had overpowered it with natural light. Cody,
Yeah,
did you guys do
exactly.
anything to accentuate that little that little bit of horizon line in the deep background? Did you guys do anything to that, or was this kind of how it landed?
In the wide at night.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
there are some windows there
some of the coverage.
Yeah, to try to hold some of that detail, there's some windows there because yeah, obviously we didn't want it to be just a black nothing because then you kind of lose the sense of depth and I mean you have this cool location, you don't want to lose it all and bury it in the shadows. So yeah, there is trying to find whatever light was available in those areas, lift that up a little bit, but also make sure it feels like there's no other light in that area, right? So I'm just trying to bring it down and not expose any additional lighting that Steve might have had. So but yeah, I mean that stuff didn't really take that much effort because you know it was lit great. So it's really just making sure the preference was to make sure that firelight in general doesn't ever go that like reddish orange. It was more of like try to keep it more of a yellowish orange, and that's more of a kind of like the aesthetic approach of the show in general. I think all of us kind of just prefer that color for firelight anyway. So you know, shifting that stuff and then also trying to make sure that we don't crush anything on all the tighter coverage too. So it was, you know, using some curves and some little bit of shadow lift to make sure that, I mean, if it was real firelight, we probably wouldn't have anything visible past a certain distance from that source. But because it's a show, we don't want it to actually be dark. So yeah, we definitely did a little bit of curve grades and stuff to lift those shadows up to make sure that there was still a little bit of detail as much as possible. So.
Daniel, there's a few questions that have come up. Do you want to have a look at those? And
yeah, there's one here from Kevin asking about if we developed a series of LUTs, or if we had one show LUT. Lookup table for those. I'm sure probably most people listening know what that is, but it's basically like a look that you apply to just the raw camera image to give you sort of a starting point. And some shows you'll have multiple ones. You'll have one for daytime, one for nighttime. But actually we did, so Christian and his colorist developed a LUT for the pilot episodes. And he provided us with that and also said, you guys might do your own thing for year 20. You know, you may change it up. But actually we ended up just using the same LUT for everything. That was interesting. Even though the looks are different, that one LUT kind of gave us a certain, it had a little kind of secret sauce in it that just seemed to work. We were live grading as well. So we had our DIT, Andrew Richardson, was on set. Basically, he was doing a kind of a preliminary grade as we were shooting, which, you know, mostly I think what we did with the year 20 stuff is we warmed it up a little bit, especially for exteriors, because a lot of the year 0 stuff was that they shot in Chicago was kind of like very wintry and a little bit cooler. So even though the year 20 stuff looks a lot more saturated, and Cody, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. Image wise, I don't think there really is that much more saturation. I think most of that really comes from Ruth Ammon's work, production designer, and also Helen Huang, the costume designer. You know, those two brought so much color into the year 20 material that on our end, I felt like we didn't actually have to do that much. The thing that I really remember spending a lot like time on was finding just the right foliage color. That was one of the things that that I think we spent a fair amount of time on. Cody, why don't you, if you could speak to that, and maybe as you're talking, I might bring up a couple of, I'm going to attempt to share my screen and
okay,
bring up a couple of stills of this.
Yeah, so I remember that LUT. I wasn't involved in the creation of that. I hopped on kind of like once Final Color started, and that was something I think Sam and Christian had a hand in developing. And it's a print-based emulation, so it's definitely got the film gamut, and that's part of where that nice rich green comes in. When you have that sort of print emulation, that the green swings from that digital green into that more kind of lush, darker green. And so that was part of it. Yeah, as the year 20 part of the approach of the show was to make sure that those lush greens really stand out and that it feels like the world is recovering from less human encroachment, I think. And yes, I would say maybe in the earlier episodes that might have been boosted a little bit, but going forward we weren't really boosting colors at all. It was more of taking whatever you guys had captured in the camera and I feel like it was mostly reducing things that stood out, making sure that we're not emphasizing the wrong area of focus and things like that. And there was maybe a different approach per episode because, like we've mentioned, that they sort of are okay being on their own to some extent, and I think part of that too is just a slight like creative preference between yourself, Daniel, and Steve, and the story kind of allows us to take these scenes and maybe grade them a little bit different per episode as well, so that it's okay if this scene feels a little more lifted and compressed here, and like the shot of the sun coming through the window there, it's like we want that to feel lifted and airy and not super crushed and everything, because it should feel like the ambient light coming in and lighting the whole room. So I think that's what's cool about this show too, is that we didn't have to go super contrasty to get the point across. It's like, let's let it feel soft and natural and just let the set design and the costume design kind of speak for itself. We're not trying to take over any of that stuff.
There's a couple more questions. Steve's asking for Daniel, do you recall how the Tribe 7s were tuned, ST or X?
Yeah, so we used a couple different sets of lenses. Christian had used the Masterbuilts on the pilot episodes, which are really beautiful lenses, and they have a really distinctive flare. Like they flare a lot. So we had decided to add a second set of lenses called the Tribe 7 Blackwings, and mainly because we knew that for our material we were going to be using a lot of flame and like raw flame that we were just going to be lighting, just with that, torches and things like that. And so we had done some testing on the Masterbuilts, beautiful lenses, but we wanted something that would flare a bit less. So we actually used the Blackwings for a lot of that work. And we used, they come in different tunings, it's called, is what someone's asking about. Steve is asking about. So we use the S tunings, which are kind of the least detuned. So they have the least amount of flaring, but they still had a really beautiful, soft quality. And we really fell in love with those lenses. And I would say we probably shot 80% of the show on the 37mm Blackwing. Like I think Steve was telling me, Jeremy, that I think you guys basically almost only used that lens.
Yeah, there wasn't like a huge variation on that, actually. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably what gives the show a really distinctive look too, because we weren't all over the map with things. Like there's a great deal of consistency with all that stuff. No, like
we have a couple
never
other
used a long
questions
lens
here.
for anything, I think. There's one about
Yeah, I
grading
think
firelight.
there was. Oh yeah, and Cody, you spoke a little bit about this in terms of the grading firelight, and that was something I noticed too. Every time we had a couple scenes that were just lit entirely with fire, and yeah, you had one thing that was kind of interesting was that we graded an HDR, which was new to me, and that to me that the fire would looked amazing when we were looking at it in HDR. Can you explain? Because I feel like I still don't even understand what HDR is. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we did do this in Dolby Vision, so it's HDR with metadata to make it SDR, and then I'm sure a lot of people who watched it streaming on HBO probably saw that SDR feed. But there's an HDR version that you can see. So part of maybe the first choice and decision you have to consider when going HDR is, how bright do we want to go? Because the spec goes all the way up to 10,000 nits, which is blindingly bright. But most of the time we're at 1,000 nits, which is still very bright. Your typical Standard, SDR TV is tuned to 100 nits, so 100 to 1000 is a pretty big jump potentially. It's a much bigger container to work with. And for a show like this, we could have gone that bright, but I think there was a conscious decision again, because we already have this like film palette and this soft contrast feel and everything. Going that bright would have probably been jarring and maybe even distracting. So in general, the HDR is usually hovering around maybe 300. And that's just felt right for that HDR container. So could we have gone brighter? Sure. But what can HDR give you, right? Fire, like you said, you get a little more detail in all those really bright specular highlights and things, and it can look really cool. The drawback, for Daniel, for you to consider, is some of those things that you're used to kind of blowing out and clipping on set now may not be clipped anymore. And so we have to make a decision in post. Do we want to go ahead and clip that out, or do we like the way that now we've opened up that highlight detail and maybe it looks a little more interesting and dynamic that way? Then we've done that HDR. Then we still have to compress it back down to SDR for any sort of SDR displays and things like that. So it's just, it's another cool creative tool to have at your disposal. And I think a lot of streaming shows are going HDR now, not everything, but it's just another thing to take advantage of. So I think for us, though, just keeping it sort of contained fit the show and the look of the show a little bit better. So
yeah, it was interesting what you mentioned about holding highlights where you didn't expect them to be there. When on the Frank's apartment set, that whole we had these massive kind of 270 degrees of windows, which had like basically a big 300-foot backdrop, which we used it was a product called the Roscoe Soft Drop, which was new to me, and I think relatively new product. And it's basically it's a fabric backdrop that you can light from behind. So we were able to actually place sunlight, a sunlight source on the other side of the backdrop, and you could see it on camera, and it looked it looked like you had a sun in the sky essentially, and it would still have enough transmission that you could light the characters with it, and looked great on set. But then when we went to grade it in HDR, you could actually see the texture of the backdrop in the highlight, which was crazy to me because we would put like a 24K lamp on the other side of it. The electrics were like worried about lighting the translate on fire, and there was so much exposure pumping through it. And we're also using a filter to kind of haze it slightly to kind of make it all blend together. And then when we got in and started grading it, actually was a little bit of a challenge for us because it didn't look, suddenly you could see this texture inside of it. So it took a little bit of puzzling to get rid of, to make it look like the sun again.
Right. And that's one of those cases where just grading in HDR wasn't enough. We had to actually bring the curve down so aggressively that it was almost as bright as the original SDR was on set, right? We had to bring that curve down so much just to compress all that highlight detail so that it still felt pleasing. It didn't look harsh, like a harsh white clip or anything, but it just had to be brought down so much that we could scrunch all that detail and just lose all that stuff. So it wasn't, like you said, exposing what the fabric actually was.
I'll show you guys a couple images of that. If you're seeing it, this is the this is looking towards the Roscoe Soft Drop, and this apartment is based on a real apartment in Chicago, and the translight itself mimicked the exact view. And so they stay in this apartment over 80 days, and the power goes out and it gets colder. So we had to add frost to the windows, and the entire episode takes place in this apartment. So we kind of worked to try to make that look evolve, as time went on. Okay, so I'll head back here. Let's see now. We have a couple other questions. In terms of fire detail, what was the in-camera codec? So I think we actually shot in ARRI RAW. Cody, what's your opinion on that in terms of, do you think that helped us get a little bit more highlight detail shooting in RE raw? Do you notice the difference?
Occasionally, yes. I think the funny thing is the ProRes on the RE bodies holds up very well, and I've never worked with stuff that was shot ProRes and felt like we're missing anything. That said, there's always the peace of mind of having that raw additional information available. And I can't say that if this hadn't been raw, would we have been in trouble? I don't think so. But yeah, having that extra little bit of detail is always great. So, but I don't manipulate the raw data as much. Usually, if we leave it as whatever metadata you guys had shot on set, that's 99% of the time plenty to work with. So the raw ProRes debate is still a debate. I don't have a definitive answer for you.
Well, Jeremy, I'm curious for you, what, because obviously you were involved throughout. What was post like for you? Because we finished shooting in, I guess we finished shooting in early July, and then what was your involvement like? What was that experience like for you going through post?
Well, post was really unusual on this show in many ways because there was, I mean, I don't know if you, maybe, I'm not sure if your episodes really were affected as much by this, but many of the episodes really changed quite a lot in the editing. And that was something that doesn't really typically happen that much, but there was, I think there was the organic process of making the show continued in the editing where discoveries were made and it seemed like the material was a lot more malleable than it usually is. And I think it's also partly because we're telling disparate stories that are all interwoven. And there's quite a bit of, possibility in terms of like how these stories are blended and how things play off of each other. So there was quite a lot of like moving this from this episode into that episode and, kind of getting a little bit more experimental with some of the treatments of the time transitions than was originally intended. Sometimes changing quite dramatically, like what was going to be cut against what. We're always telling the same story, but there's, in this kind of show, there's many ways of telling that story. And I think because, Patrick in particular was so open to trying and experimenting and playing, there were some incredible discoveries along the way. So it was, I wasn't, there wasn't really a cutting room because of COVID and people were working remotely, but I was looking at cuts, of every episode, not just the episodes that I directed. And, over the course of months, really just like seeing how things were evolving and changing. And it was, fascinating and a little bit scary, to be honest, at some points, because it's like, oh, we're trying that. Wow. Okay. And then it's just like seeing like how things work and sort of adjusting your original idea of how something goes together to a new idea of how it might go together. And, some of those changes can be quite radical. And I think in the end, all the experimenting was extremely successful in that, we found collectively, the group found, some amazing ways of telling the story. And the show became what it actually is. The language was already baked into the show, that way of moving seamlessly through time. But the specifics of, within each episode, how we were going to tell these stories was very, not playful exactly, but it was treated as something that could be approached in a more playful kind of way, than you would have originally thought. And and it was actually kind of an interesting process for me because, I, as a filmmaker, I'm aware of the malleability of material, but not to this extent. Like in TV, typically, you don't really, kind of really reinvent things to that degree. But I think like in some of the episodes that you did, probably not that much occurred in that direction, but some of the episodes were very bold in terms of their, newfound things that moved through them.
Well,
So
4
yeah,
changed
and then
quite a bit, I think.
yes, 4 changed hugely, actually. Yeah, that was a big one. But then also, once you start adding elements of sound and music, and Dan Romer was the composer, did an incredible job, and that just kind of really impacted the storytelling in ways too, because it knits things together in ways that are really beautiful and allows you to kind of play with the images and Patrick also made many discoveries in terms of dialogue and like using snippets of things from other episodes and using them in a very sort of semi-abstract way through in episode 2 in particular, that changed quite a lot. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, I mean, it was a very, very interesting, very organic, unusual process actually, all the way through. But in the end, I think like what's so amazing is that it just you look at it and everything feels as if it was decided way ahead of time, and then
Yeah,
it
yeah.
seems to have such a tightly structured, designed
Yeah.
thing. But like if you would read the original scripts, that's not what the shows actually are often,
Yeah.
to a great degree. I mean, the DNA is the same, but
Hmm.
there's many, 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 new things that are like woven through that were never originally there.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
I was wondering, Jeremy, if you could talk a little bit about episode 9, which we
Mm.
were talking before about how every episode is kind of like its own um, world in a way, but episode 9 is
Mm.
really like that. And it's such, to me, that one is such an interesting balance of different tones.
Hmm.
And that was one of the first cuts that I saw, I think, early on was episode 9. I was just like, wow, this is amazing. Did you want to
Hmm.
talk a little bit about that one? Because I just think that would have been such an
Sure.
interesting kind of tightrope to walk.
It was, I have to say, like, as a piece of writing, that original script was so fabulous. It was so exciting. It was like when I was thinking about which episodes I would direct from the whole series, I think 9 was probably the first one where I said, I really want to direct this episode. And it was so, like, it's a little movie in itself. And I think because from a story point of view, it kind of like stops the bigger story that's going on, kind of stops for episode 9, and we flash back and tell a year 1 story or a year 2 story. And like we find out what happened to Jeevan, which we didn't know until this point in episode
Hmm.
9, because he disappeared at a certain point. And it's a sort of standalone in a way, but it reverberates through the show in very meaningful ways. And I love that it was situated towards the end. It's so unexpected that at that point in the series, you're going to just flash back to a whole other story that is not pushing forward the bigger story. But it's so satisfying in its own way. And as a piece of writing, it was so
Hmm.
beautiful. But I also was a little scared because it is tonally very unusual. And it's really two episodes in one in a way. It's like the story of Jeevan and Kirsten in the cabin when their relationship is fraying, and they've been together now for like a year and a half or something, and it's it's difficult, and then it's what happens to Jeevan when after he gets separated from her and has this crazy experience in this paper maker's shopping mall with a lot of pregnant women who end up giving birth at exactly the same time. And it's a sort of such a fanciful idea in a way, but it's the potential for it to be really moving and funny and strange, and
Hmm.
certainly it was all there in the page to be something amazing, but it was also a bit scary because it could so easily just go wrong.
Yeah.
And we worked really, really hard on that with the casting of the women and with the choosing of that location, which was like we looked at so many places to find the perfect one. And we found this amazing group of actresses who are just incredible, some of whom were actually pregnant. um,
Mm.
and and we did a lot of work. We had a doula come in, and we had all these like meetings with the doula and talking about the birthing process, and what it would be like in this kind of situation, what all these the story is really emotional because you have all these women who have in the story who are now alone after the pandemic. All their loved ones have died and they're stranded, and they find each other, and they give they find each other in this like strange community to give birth, and they're all kind of sort of synchronized biologically, and they give birth at the same time. And and there's a then Jeevan, who's not really a doctor, who's pretending to
Mhm.
be a doctor, or is made to pretend that he's a doctor so that he can help and give
Mhm.
birth to these babies. And it's like in a time of like so much death, and then there's birth, right? And it just like I get a bit choked up thinking about that, when it was really something like when we were filming it, we were very, very conscious of the fact that all these women had been through trauma, and then this is like a sign of hope, right? After that, that there could be life after death, that after all that horribleness, there's hope. And that's really what the show's about. You know, it encapsulates that in a very, you know, kind of primal way. And you know, what's more hopeful than a baby being born? And it's just, you know, and we actually show a baby being born, and we, you know, we're present in this moment. And it's it was a fabulous episode to shoot. It was so much fun to do that and work with this group of people. And you know, but it was a lot of rehearsal. Like that whole choreographed birthing sequence is a major thing. Like it's many minutes of film, and it's, you know, it's one big sequence, and we rehearsed it like a play, and you know, blocking it, and we all came in on the weekend and figured it all out with the actresses. And it was, I don't know, it was a really special experience. It was a ton of research, you know, to kind of get it right. And I don't know, tonally, I think in the end, it really managed, I think, that perfect balance of being funny and strange and unexpected and emotional. And you know, and the score, Dan just did such a beautiful job of scoring that sequence. And yeah, but also the first half of the episode for me was really kind of brilliant too. You know, I think Matilda Lawler, who plays young Kirsten, is so incredible, and Himesh Patel, who plays Jeevan, is such a great actor. And you know, those scenes that we shot up in a cabin in Muskoka, you know, in 5 feet of snow, you know, it's like, it was an amazing experience. So it was really challenging to shoot up there, but wow, it was just so amazing. And we had, you know, the snow never stopped coming, and we shot scenes in the snow, and we had to, you know, dig roads to get in there. And you know, it was a really making a movie, that episode. It was major, but it was really interesting and fun.
That was quite incredible. Like I came up there for like one day just to shoot some second unit and some drone stuff. And I was shocked at how like remote that cabin was. There was like one road to get into it. And you know, on one hand I was like, oh my God, are these guys crazy? But then when I saw it, it's really was worth it. Like, and that's part of like why you sometimes don't see those kinds of locations, because it's just too hard to get there. So I really admired that you guys made that choice to actually get out, you know, make it out there. And because it was such an extraordinary location.
Well,
do we want to
I'll
show?
tell you something.
We have a clip of that. Yeah.
Sure, but I just want to say something to your point. It's like, I think, you know, of course, everybody in the production did not want us to shoot there because it was so challenging a location. But honestly, it's because, you know, because I've directed things like Game of Thrones, and where we really shoot like in the middle of nowhere, right? And other shows I've done too, where I've shot it. You know, I did, just previous to this, I did a show, Mosquito Coast, for Apple, and we shot in the desert. You know, for the entire episode was shot in the desert. And you know, I've done a lot of these kind of things where you shoot in places where you think that's impossible. You can't shoot a whole thing there, and of course you can. And it's like, you know, I knew it was possible to do it. Of course, it's challenging, but there's ways of doing this. And we're not, people have shot on mountaintops, people shoot in deserts, people shoot on the water, people shoot in, you know, we shoot in all kinds of places. And it can, you know, believe me, Muskoka is not the hardest location I've ever shot in. And but yes, it's logistically challenging, and it's a little bit more work for everybody. And definitely it's difficult for the crew, I have to say. But at the same time, I don't think there was a single crew member who didn't think it was worth it when we were there, because it was spectacularly beautiful, and it was magical to be there. Like when we were all standing there in 4 feet of snow, and the snow was coming down, and you couldn't hear a thing, and it was like, you can't create that anywhere else. Like it was pure magic. Like there's just no way you could do this anywhere. And I think that's what makes the show. Like it's a show that, you know, we went for it, you know, in situations where you needed to go for it, we went for it, and we put in the extra effort, and it really shows, I think. And by the way, we looked at 1,000 cabins. Like it wasn't like we made that decision lightly. It wasn't like, you know, like we tried to find something closer, easier, you know, it didn't exist. When we found this cabin is like 120-year-old cabin that's never been renovated. And it's gorgeous, and the surroundings are amazing, and the lakefront, and like it had everything we needed, right? And it was perfect. And it just that did not exist anywhere else. And God knows we tried. We looked at every lake in Ontario. Then there's thousands of them. We looked everywhere, and it just this was it. So anyway, yes, let's show a clip.
Okay, great. So
that's the clip from
Byron,
episode 9.
And Jeremy, do you want to show? I don't know if we'll be able to show the whole thing. There's the wolf attack, and I shouldn't have even said that, but there's a part in the woods at night, and then there's him waking up. Do you want to show part of it, or we just show the whole thing?
I think the wolf attack, and we just can get to the wake up, and then don't have to show the rest of that.
Great.
Really.
Great.
Okay.
Frank.
Pretentious. I love how the you guys chose to show the actual wolf attack, because I remember reading that and thinking like, oh, how are those guys going to do this? But I love how simple that is and how unexpected and kind of terrifying it is to mainly just hear it.
Yeah. Well, that was a big thing with this show is to first of all, its approach to violence is very oblique. Like it's part of that. This is not what The Walking Dead or The Road. I mean, there is violence in this world, but it's very abstracted and it's over there. The show's not about that, so it doesn't get any kicks out of showing violent things. And also there's a kind of there is a sort of humor and shock in the way it's presented, and that's sort of more interesting than just to do the obvious thing. So, but I do want to say that the lighting, somebody was asking about the lighting for that sequence, and this is a great thing about working with Steve too, is it was very minimal. All these night exteriors were very simple. We had one moonlight basically that was like a million miles away that was like shining into the forest a bit, and then the headlight on Jeevan, which basically lights him and lights the scene, when he's pointing his head towards the comic book on the ground, and that's how we see it. And we see what is coming off his head, and his face is lit by that, and lots of testing with that to make that work. But it's very, very, very minimal, which made night scenes really simple to shoot in a way, because we weren't futzing around a lot with this thing and that thing, and and then everything that's during the day, there's nothing at all. Like we almost never even used reflectors or bounces and things. Very little of that kind of stuff. Which actually, this sort of leads to another thing that I just wanted to talk about with you briefly, which is just sort of guiding principles of the show from a visual perspective. I know there's certain things that were always in the back of my mind and Steve's, things like macro micro, which is like one of my big things for this show, that it's like people in relation to nature. And in the urban environments, there's this sense of like, small people, huge buildings, that there's a kind of God's eye point of view or a cosmic sort of feeling about things, even though we're telling a very intimate story. And we continue that in the year 20 in a big way. And there's always this kind of feeling that there's something bigger going on than what's going on in these little characters' lives, that there's a kind of epicness or a sort of, that these stories are symbolic in a way, or they're kind of, I don't know, like there's a larger thing at work in this show than just telling stories of these characters' lives. There's something that resonates in a bigger way. And I think that sort of macro micro idea was something that was really key. And so it was always important for me to find those, kind of grand vistas and the kind of a sense of scale, playing with scale quite a lot. And, I don't know, it's affecting in ways that are very subtle but important for the show.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have other things that there are things in your mind that were kind of general things to hang on to?
Yeah. Like, I think that I liked something that you said early on was this idea of the intimate and the epic, and how they kind of overlap each other. And to me, there's something very so cinematic about that. That's one of the kind of unique things about the cinematic art form, is that you can achieve that through all these different perspectives of playing with subjective and objective perspective. And we often talked about that. We would do these huge overhead kind of bird's eye shots that kind of became a visual motif, and that's something that was established by Hiro and Christian in the pilot episodes. And we would sometimes call that the Dr. 11 perspective, or Dr. 11 POV, and which is, I don't know how I'm going to describe who Dr. 11 is, but fictional character within the story who lives in a kind of a space station looking down upon Earth. And so it's almost like a satellite view of things. And there was something to me that was like so evocative about that, when you would be in these really intimate scenes, and then sometimes we would cut to these big sort of almost like overview effect shots that would kind of remind you that this is one piece of like this big story, or remind you of like the scale of things, of how minuscule these people are in like the vastness of nature, or in the vastness of a city. And so that was something that we often thought a lot about, like, and just the goal was always to kind of create these sort of very considered compositions and movements that again, kind of like, one of the things that I loved about the show, like just watching the episodes that Hiro did, was just the sense of pacing, and often like just living in a shot for a long time. And so we kind of always had this awareness that the way that it was going to be cut wouldn't necessarily be cut in this really quick way. And we kind of wanted every shot to be as good as possible, because we knew that might sit on this shot for a while. And that was one of the things I love about the show, is just the pacing. It kind of, to me, it right from the start, I think the show says that it requires it requires a lot of attention from the audience, because things aren't really spelled out. And I think part of that visual style communicates that you requires a level of attention from the audience that really also shows a lot of respect to the audience, and expects the audience to kind of meet the storytelling where it is, as opposed to trying to just kind of spoon feed it.
Yeah.
And I'll say
And I think there's a
too.
lot. Okay. Mhm.
No,
No, no, go on.
go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, like, there's
Well,
a
I
lot
was
of, like, and part of what you're saying.
The
No, you
delay
first.
part. I was just going to say I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention like our camera operators and Sasha Mork and Greg Frankovich, who also really contributed to that. Like Sasha is just an incredible camera operator, and he would, for me, if somebody who is so used to operating myself, it felt like such a pleasure to be able to work with really good operators who I think the style of the show was a real opportunity for them to kind of like we would always try to find the structure with, even if it was in a forest, try to find interesting structures and anchors in which to kind of place the characters and create this feeling of just very considered compositions, almost like one of the other visual themes is obviously theater. And so we would often think about things like, finding these master shots that almost had a kind of like proscenium arch, or had a kind of like a mise en scène that was somewhat reminiscent of like watching theater. So that was on our minds as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I mean, one of the sort of guiding things with this too was that we like letting things play out in a frame, and the knowing that it's not a cutty kind of show. It's about performance in large degree. So it's just like doing long takes and letting scenes play out, and not breaking them up into small bits and pieces. And we did coverage, of course, but not excessively. And all the coverage is extremely well chosen. And, we got what we needed, and not things just to get them. And I think that all the directors, I think, were extremely considered in that way. And every shot was an interesting shot. Like there was never a wasted shot, I don't think. How did you feel about that in your approach?
Yeah, it was interesting because coming into it, I remember thinking, I think I had this idea that in television, you're kind of evaluated by how many setups you can do in a day. And I'm sure on some shows it is like that. And so I remember feeling a little stressed, like when we first started. I had the benefit of really getting a chance to really plan in a very detailed way with Lucy Cherniak, who directed that first episode that I shot, and our coverage was really, really minimal, and I think that also really allowed her to really dial in the performances, it made me realize if you really take the time, if you really do get the performances dialed in, well, then it doesn't force the edit. So actually you can cut when it feels right to cut. Like just the cutting in the show, I think to me really stands out as, each cut feels like it's, really well chosen. And I think, if you just shoot a lot of coverage and you kind of like hose it down, as they say, well, oftentimes that forces cutting because the shots are subpar, so you can end up forcing to cut that way just to kind of make it work.
Yeah, we never hosed it down. That's my least favorite expression in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say we did have.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. There's a delay. I think there's a delay is increasing a little bit. Yeah, please go ahead, Jeremy.
No, I was just going to say, like, how, just a more general question now, but how the aesthetic of the show dovetails with your own aesthetic and, your background a little bit, and then how that kind of felt kind of moving into this territory.
I think for me, pardon me, I think for me, in terms of the aesthetic of the show, the thing that, I mean, I've always sort of leaned towards naturalism, I would say. I think especially coming from a documentary background. And I love, oftentimes I feel like for my work, it's more about paring away than adding. And this show was a really good opportunity for that because everything we were shooting was so beautiful. The sets and, pardon me, sets in the wardrobe. And so much of it was actually just about paring away from my perspective. Yeah, and but at the same time, I also really wanted to challenge myself to really create, very considered, composed frames and really try to make every movement and every composition count. And all the directors were so in line with that it really just made such a great collaboration. So I learned a lot.
I think yes. I think the collaboration between the DPs and the directors on this show was really a thing of beauty. Actually, I think it was such a nice synchronicity between everybody in terms of their own aesthetic inclinations, anyway, and then just coming together on the show was just like I think it was a joy for everybody because we all saw the show the same way, and there was never any sort of like push pull in terms of like how to frame things or how to pace things or how to cover things. Like I think it was just a pleasure for me to watch the dailies all the time of other directors' work as well. And it was just a seamless thing of your work and Steve's work, and it just it was really a lovely collaboration all the way around, I thought, and a nice melding of our own personal tastes, which seemed to align really well on the show. So, well chosen for the group, I think.
Cool.
I think, is there one more question here? Actually, I think we're kind of nearing the end, right? Looks like we're pretty much there.
I think that's a pretty good place to wrap it up.
I think so too. I guess at this point we should thank each other. So I'm going to thank you, and you can thank me, and everybody, I guess, from the CSC who's involved in this. And I should say also that everybody who's watching can also subscribe to the CSC channel, and there's a lot of great interviews on there for people to watch, including this one when it gets posted. So I guess thank you all for doing this.
Thanks, everybody.